560 The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. A story out earlier this week. Feds raid California maternity hotels, quote unquote, for birth tourists. Federal agents in California raided 20 maternity hotels where Chinese women allegedly paid $40,000 to $80,000 to give birth in the United States for citizenship. This has been going on for some time, it's reported. And the question becomes, so if that is illegal to engage in that sort of operation, then how can it be constitutional, interpreting the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment, for people that have temporary residence here, particularly those who have temporary residence here illegally, and give birth to a child? How can it be that that confers citizenship to that child? And this is part of what J.D. Vance had to say, you'll recall, with Margaret Brennan over the weekend.
Well, this is a country founded by immigrants.
Well, this is a country founded by... This is a very unique country, and it was founded by some immigrants and some settlers. But just because we were founded by immigrants doesn't mean that 240 years later that we have to have the dumbest immigration policy in the world.
It wouldn't seem to mean that. For more on the interpretation, I'm pleased to be joined again by Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
So you penned a piece for the Civitas Institute at University of Texas on this issue of birthright citizenship, which is now being hotly debated thanks to Trump's executive order. And you come down suggesting that the case that that interpretation that that is supposed to be settled, quote unquote, that the 14th Amendment confers birthright citizenship, that case is not as strong as its proponents would suggest.
Yes, I think it's actually clearly wrong if you go back and put this thing into its entire context. It's a very difficult issue to get your hands on, and it turns on an interplay of lots of words in the 14th Amendment. The operative clause is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, emphasis, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And so the first question you want to ask is sort of what is it that makes you a citizen? And it's quite clear that there were citizens in the United States before the passage of the 14th Amendment. So you have to go back to the earlier practice and to figure out what that was. And it turns out citizenship in virtually every area, and this was stressed in some of the cases that came down, a case called Minor, was basically an arrangement in which you demonstrated loyalty to the sovereign, and the sovereign decided to give you protection. So there was an allegiance component that was built into it. You then start talking about the question, who could do allegiance? And it basically turns out that what you have to do is to have some kind of an undivided loyalty. So what you're talking about is the sojourner case. Somebody just pops in. And if you even look at the 14th Amendment, these people are residents of no state whatsoever, and they could never be citizens that way. You have to make exceptions for people who are born of American citizens overseas who don't have a residence in the state, and that's been done for a very, very long time. But there's absolutely no reason, if you just have somebody who's illegally born in the United States on a short hop, that they should be able to get citizenship. The kind of opportunism that you start to talk about is really very blatant. And then if you go back to the practices that exist everywhere in the world prior to the adoption of the 14th Amendment, I am not aware of a single case anywhere by anybody who has ever claimed that coming into a country temporarily to give birth to a child gives that child citizenship. There are very few cases of what means illegal citizenship before 1868, because A, we did not have a national policy on that, and B, we have generally open borders. But the sojourner case is perfectly common, and if there's nobody who ever fits into that, you then have to make the argument that if people who are here legally and temporarily don't give citizenship to their children, it's got to be even worse if you're talking about illegal citizenship. There's not a single area in the law of which I am aware in which the distinction between lawful and unlawful conduct is not relevant. And we're told it's relevant here. They cite passages from the 14th Amendment saying we have a very distinct Constitution. But if you read the full passages, they don't only refer to American law, they also refer to natural law. And back in 1865, that was not an anachronism. That was the way everybody thought about law in the world, including in the United States. And natural law principles only started to erode basically after the First World War.
Well,
so natural law, well, go ahead.
Amy Swearer, who's a legal fellow of the Heritage Foundation, makes this point, too, about the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is referenced in part of the argument, well, I guess both ways, because she takes it against birthright citizenship. And this was the attempt by Congress to override the Dred Scott decision. But that statute, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. And she writes, far from being an adoption of common law universal birthright citizenship, that act intended to bestow birthright citizenship only on the children of those who, like newly freed slaves, owed complete allegiance to the United States and were subject to the fullest extent of its political jurisdiction. So if you put the Civil Rights Act of 1866, for example, in the full context of the time, it actually cuts against birthright citizenship, she argues.
Yes. Yeah, she's right, because what happened is they took out the Indians not taxed, but everybody understood under the word subject to the jurisdiction thereof that Indians were not citizens. And in fact, they did become citizens, but only by a statute passed in 1924. But I disagree with her on one point. If you actually look at the common law rules on jus soli, that is, right to citizenship by virtue of birth, there is no reference in any of the cases that this is conferred upon people who are illegal aliens. And if you're going through the natural law principle, the dominant principle, which has always been there, is nobody could profit from his own wrong. That's as fundamental a principle as you could find. It starts in Roman times. It's all in Latin. And then all of a sudden, that stuff becomes irrelevant when you have a statute. If it turns out that you're trying to figure out what the word means, you can't simply say that it means invading armies. What you have to do is to look at the context. And what happened is the very people who adopted the 1866 statute were worried about its constitutionality, and what they wanted to do was to make it good in the Constitution. So it seems extremely odd to say that there is a complete unannounced reversal of policy on this particular question by the time you get to the 14th Amendment. There was no reversal in policy. There is, interestingly, a huge debate over the word "or" in brackets, because there's testimony by a senator named Howard. And what he said is he gave 3 cases in the enumeration about foreigners and so forth, and then people who essentially worked in the government. And if you looked at that, the way in which it's put in most of the cases is there's no "or" there. But if you actually look at what's happening and you go back to the original situation, it turns out this is just a transcription of a speech. And it's very easy for people who are doing speech transcriptions to leave out an "or." And so there's this huge debate as to whether or not it should or should not be put back in. The reason is if you don't put it back in, and then the only people who are cut out are those people who are essentially diplomats. If you put it back in, then what happens is all the foreigners who are illegally in the country are covered as well. I basically think the arguments in favor of the "or" being put back in are much more consistent with the basic structure. And it's a very serious problem with legislative history. When you take extemporaneous remarks and put them down, there's a transcription error. So legislative history prepared by the formal statements written before and after a bill are much more reliable than this kind of text. So we then go back to first principle. Go ahead.
Well, let's go to the case that's pointed to, and we've talked about quite a bit over the years when this issue has come up, the Wong Kim Ark case of 1898, because this is what birthright citizenship proponents again hang their hat on. But the facts don't really match up with the argument that people in this country illegally who have a child, that child is automatically a citizen, because the appearance of the gentleman in that case, who was the moving party in that case, were in the country legally, even though they were not citizens. And so that it doesn't seem to, and the court is basically silent on the issue of parents being here legally or illegally, if I'm recalling. So, I mean, I guess you could make the argument either way, as people are, but I mean, the facts don't really support. The facts don't say what the proponents of birthright citizenship say they say.
The facts begin with somebody who was in long-time business in San Francisco. That's the lead. They don't talk about legality or illegality. The words are not mentioned in the opinion, but they do refer to both the Slaughterhouse case and to a case called Eck, and both of which contain very clear data which say that parents born of illegal, children born of illegal aliens in the United States are not citizens. And what the modernists try to do is they try to say, well, that's dicta. Well, first of all, it's a much more considered statement than that. But even if you say that it was not the holding because the plaintiff in the Eck case was an Indian, what happens is this is very considered dicta. And the way you think about dicta is not say, well, if you don't like it, you disregard it. What you have to do is look very carefully at it and say that it has a presumption, since it was seriously stated, of accurately stating the law. And can you find anything anywhere else that's going to displace it? And Wong Kim Ark does not do that. The Wong case essentially is about the children of lawful aliens. And so think of the incentive effect. We want people to come to the United States. And what happens is one of the inducements is if you come here and go through channel, your children will get citizenship. Those are the people whom we want to come. But if you do it exactly the other way, it's going to go exactly in the opposite direction. And what's going to happen at that particular point is if you don't want people to come to the United States, don't give them an added incentive to come by essentially allowing their children to become citizens. What is striking about this debate, in particular Jim Ho's very nice article and John Yu's recent article on that, is no one who argues in favor of birthright citizens argues in favor of it as a matter of first principle. It's all because of these very tenuous interpretations of the text. If you do the first principle argument, it goes the other way. As I mentioned to you, the Senator Howard, who did all this stuff, he referred to both natural law and to national law. Natural law goes exactly the opposite way. And this was not an incoherent body of law. In the 1860s in the United States, like everywhere else in the world, it was the dominant principle. I actually, quite unrelated to this, I got sufficiently irate some of the articles I had seen on it. I wrote this, very long paper tracing the history of natural law from Roman times on forward. And essentially, all the citizenship rules that you see that come out of that are perfectly coherent. And the system is quite tight and has very attractive utilitarian fashion. And so what happens is when you take the word natural out of that debate, but essentially you're completely skewing it so that one part of the game doesn't play. Remember, as far back as Calvin's case in 1608, it was a deal. You give us allegiance, we give you protection. Does the illegal alien give allegiance to the United States? Then where's the quid pro quo?
So how does this get to the Supreme Court for consideration of precedent on the matter, both legislative as well as case law? Does Trump's EO on the topic and it being challenged legally now, does that potentially make its way to the Supreme Court for a decision on this?
Everybody believes that this is going to be on an express train to the Supreme Court. The decision in the court below is an intellectual disgrace. What he did privately said this is blatant. Cites three cases. One of them is the Wong case, which he doesn't discuss. Then he cites two other cases that are totally irrelevant and says it's obvious that this is wrong. So somebody's going to challenge that on appeal. It's going to be a more interesting stand to the case because if you look at the executive orders, one of the reasons that makes it quite defensible is it exempts all children of illegal aliens who were born in the United States to date, and it only takes effect on people born 30 days or more after what's going on. And so if anybody who is a current person doesn't have standing to challenge a rule that doesn't do it, and so it's kind of a tricky question if you actually look at the executive order to figure out who has standing. But I have the following very strong view. You have an issue of this momentous importance. You find some way to get it up to the Supreme Court so that they could give you an authoritative decision. And at which point, by the way, there'll probably be 100 briefs on each side of this game. It is without question, because of its ideological valence, and because of the strange bedfellows that it creates on both sides of the issue, that you are going to see more ink spilled on this than you've seen on everything else. Look, I mean, I get lots of calls to talk on radio from time to time, but this one everybody seems to want to talk about. They want to talk about everybody on every side because there is no obvious alignment on this particular question. Many conservatives are on the side of illegality and others are not. And so the Supreme Court's going to do that. But as I said to you, start from first principle and ask yourself, if in 1866 there was no protection given to illegal aliens, what was it as a matter of principle that led people to reverse themselves in 1868? They used these very broad words. Everybody concedes that they cover Indians, but they're not mentioned. And so the question is, why don't they cover other people if it turns out their loyalties are to a different sovereign from our own? And essentially, in this particular case, we want permanent aliens who are subjected to the laws. They do it. Illegal aliens haven't renounced their former state. They have intentions to go back or they can be expelled. And so their children should not be citizens.
Professor Richard Epstein, the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor, Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you. Take care. And bye-bye, Amy. I didn't hear from you.
Okay, well, Dan was doing such a good job. I just listened and learned. But God bless. Thank you so much for coming on. We always love having you as a guest.
Okay, we'll do it again sometime. Take care.
Okay, we'll do. Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's like a hot, steaming cup of information to start your day. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Signature